Good morning and welcome to BLIXX All About Horses and Their Care, where our motto is companionship, care, and commitment. I'm your host, Gabriela Rodriguez, and today our subject is insects. Insects can make a horse really miserable in the summer, and I know that from experience as a horse owner. I look forward to the end of the winters in Maine, and I look forward to the summer and the spring, but then I remember that there are all these insects that we have to deal with, and it's very time-consuming and very challenging taking care of our horses and making sure that they're comfortable, that they don't get diseases, and that they're safe. Also, the biggest time for riding is summer, and guess what? In the summer months, that's when we have all the insects, and riding can truly be dangerous, especially if you don't know that something's bothering your horse and they're, quote, misbehaving, where it may not be misbehaving, but actually they're reacting to a biting insect. And so we have a very special guest today, and she's going to help us understand insects much better so that we can make educated decisions, informed decisions, understand the insects and their habitats, and help us take better care of our horses. So I would like to introduce to you today Dr. Kathy Murray, Integrated Pest Management Entomologist, that was a mouthful, with the Maine Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry. Welcome, Dr. Murray.
Thank you for having me.
I'm very happy to have you. Can you give us a little information about your background, how you got involved in entomology, and what exactly is an entomologist?
Well, an entomologist is a biologist that studies insects, and I got into it, I think, because I had very supportive parents and really excellent professors that guided me and provided me with the opportunity to learn what a fascinating world insects are and how we can learn a little bit about them and use that information to help protect ourselves and our resources when they become a pest. So.
Well, I was talking about how difficult they can be to deal with, but the other thing that I forgot to mention you're going to make sure that we know is that they're beneficial, they're very important in our ecosystem.
They are. They provide food for us. They're as really important as pollinators. They're biological control agents. They're predators or parasites of other insects or things that help keep our populations under control so that we're not overtaken by pests. They're food for wildlife. Birds and fish and frogs and amphibians eat them. So yes, they're really an essential part of our ecosystem, and it's just every once in a while when they become a pest. But if we know a little bit about them, we can figure out ways to manage them and protect ourselves while not completely disrupting the environment too.
Yes, and that's a very important piece of information, because if we're trying to get rid of the insects, you can destroy just with everything. You have to have a balance. And like you just said, if we start destroying insects or certain populations or species, we're going to have a problem with others.
That's
correct?
Right. Yes, a rebound effect.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And so it's just a matter of management. If you don't have a horse and you don't have to worry about being outside all the time, that's one thing. But if you have horses or animals that live outside and you have to take care of them, and when I say outside, I don't mean outside, I mean they live in their own building, perhaps their own barn, but they go outside a lot. Everybody has different ways of dealing with that, or with insects. We have all kinds of things that we're going to talk about in another show. But today, can you explain to us and talk to us about the insects?
Sure.
In general, can we start with generalities?
Yeah, right, yes. Well, insects are, of course, animals. They're a particular kind of animals that are called the arthropods, so they're actually related to one that we love to eat, which are lobsters.
And
because
that's interesting.
Yeah, I know. They have a hard exoskeleton. Their skeleton is on the outside of their body rather than on the inside like vertebrate animals like ourselves and horses.
Can I interrupt you for just a second and ask you why that is? Why do they have their skeleton on the outside? Is there a reason?
Well, it serves as their skin too. It protects them, keeps them from losing moisture. It protects their moisture. They're cold-blooded. Insects are cold-blooded. They don't generate their own heat, and so that's actually an important part about managing them and why they are so important to us in the summertime, is because they rely on external heat, the sun and the warmth of animals, to give them enough warmth to be able to be active. In the wintertime, they rest in a pretty dormant state, especially in a cold state like Maine.
Yeah.
So they persist, but they're not very active.
But that's very interesting. Before the show, you were telling me about that, and I, not knowing very much, thought, well, the frost the last frost killed everything. And that's what sometimes people talk about in barns. We wait for that last frost,
Yeah.
and then we think everything's dead, but that's not true.
No, it's killed the active stages, the adults sometimes, oftentimes, but there'll be another stage that's resting out in the woods or in the mud, somewhere
Yep.
protected and
And-
ready to develop and become active again next summer.
And you know what, I had a bit of an experience. I think it was one day, maybe it was as late in Maine as December or January, and we got a really warm day. Maybe it went up into the 60s that
Yeah.
day, and I think I remember taking the horses to the beach, and guess what? There were flies. I couldn't believe it.
Oh,
So
darn.
that's why that is, because I was just astounded, and I said, how could this be? Because they're supposed to be dead, but
Yeah.
they're not.
No,
They're just
resting.
hibernating, waiting until it warms up, until they come out.
Yeah.
So that's a whole nother facet. Okay, so as far as generalities, is there anything else that you wanted to say, just in terms of what we're going to cover today? Are the flies, mosquitoes are also flies, which I didn't know. I thought they were their own separate species, and ticks. And those are the ones that we have to deal with
Right.
here in Maine, and that horse
Right.
owners really have to worry about for
Right.
many different reasons.
Right. The world of insects is really fascinating, as you've already learned. You know, there are probably something like 2 million species of insects in the world, but only a very small fraction of them, maybe 1% at the most, have the ability to become a pest for us. And a pest is a human-defined term anyway.
Yes, that's
anytime
true.
it
Anything could be a pest, even another person, right?
Yeah. That's right. That's right. But the rest of the time, insects play such an important role, as we've already mentioned. You know,
Yes.
food for wildlife, keeping ecosystems in balance.
Birds, frogs, all those little animals
Yeah.
eat
Yep.
insects. And there's a picture on the screen right now, I think, and we see two horses look like they're happily grazing, but we don't know what's actually happening because there's grass there. It looks like it's a little overcast in the picture, so that might mean that there are certain bugs out there right now that like the overcast rather than like the sun. But in any case, those horses don't have any coverings on them, so it could be that even though they're grazing, they could still be being bitten, perhaps, because it's a still picture, so we don't see the tails. Now, these horses here look like they're covered up in armor. It's kind of sad to see them like that. But sometimes, in order to try to do something to help your horses, maybe that's something that you want to try along with the sprays and many, many other things, vaccinations. There's all kinds of things that we do to manage and try to prevent disease. And there's a picture there of a paddock, and it's got two different environments, right? For insects, one is really sunny, and the other one is shady, so there's a lot existing out there. And sometimes when I'm walking around my barn, I see them flying by. They're like little birds.
Yeah.
It's really quite interesting, right? And they're beautiful, I have to say. I found one the other day that was black and white, looked like a zebra.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I don't know what it was.
That's a predatory fly.
Okay, is
Yeah.
there like a particular name for that particular
I can't remember
one?
the name of it, but,
But
yes.
it's not a horsefly.
No, no.
It looked like a
It's one
bee
of our
except one yellow.
beneficials.
Really?
Yeah, yep. It attacks other insects and
Oh,
keeps them under
interesting.
control. Yes.
Well, I'll try not to catch any more of those. Okay, so can we start with a stable fly, perhaps? Would you like to talk about the stable flies first?
Sure,
Okay.
sure. Yeah, stable fly is probably an appropriate one to start with. You know, we find them a lot of times around horses. That's why they got that name of stable
Okay.
fly. Stable fly is
There's a picture.
particular species of fly. It has its a scientific name is Stomoxys calcitrans. It's a particular fly, but it occurs worldwide. It
Is beautiful. I mean, the colors, if you look at it and can appreciate it for that.
They are about the size of a housefly, and they're pretty just black and white.
Yeah.
The abdomen has some black spots on it, so it's somewhat distinctive.
Mm-hmm.
But they like to reproduce in decaying vegetation. Oftentimes
hay that's sitting out there.
straw,
Mm-hmm.
especially under hay bales. If they're in contact with the soil, that's
Yeah.
a good place for where they reproduce. Their larval stages survive in that. They also actually
Well, that's
survive on
interesting.
beaches with the vegetation that can wash up from pond
Seaweed
vegetation.
or-
Seaweed,
yeah?
yes. And
That's why sometimes it's a little smelly.
yes,
maybe,
yes,
I don't know.
and they're attracted to that smell. And they bite people and animals, mostly on the lower legs. And so
Okay.
if you see a horse stomping their legs,
Yeah.
that's oftentimes a sign that they're being bitten by the stable fly. It's a quite painful bite.
It is.
And it potentially can open up a wound and then can be susceptible to secondary infections.
Right.
So we want to try to manage those by eliminating larval habitat, keeping the barn and the pasture very, very clean and dry.
That means removing the manure.
Yes, cleaning the
doing
manure
something,
out,
yep.
making sure that you don't have any spilled feed or discarded bedding.
Or old hay.
Or old hay, exactly, because that provides larval habitat for them.
Right.
There's an interesting story about our forefathers back in the 1700s when they were drafting the Declaration of Independence. Apparently Thomas Jefferson wrote about this and said that it would have taken them longer to debate the whole thing, except that they were being bitten by stable flies.
I believe it. They didn't have any fly spray then either,
That's
right?
right, and the men, of course, wore their breeches and their silk stockings, and the flies were biting them right through the silk stockings.
Right through the socks. Well,
so they speedily got through the process, and
that's a really
interesting
interesting story. Well, that helps us relate a little bit, right? Because if you want to know what a horse feels like when they're being bitten, then you can just go outside and stand there and put your hands behind your back. That's what I tell people to do, because horses have no hands and you're pretty helpless.
Yeah.
And you have to stomp, and that again we'll cover on another show, but there's a lot of concussion there. It's not good.
That's right. That's right.
Now I have a question. As far as the stable flies, is the stable flies a house fly? Is the house fly is it a similar situation?
That's a good question. The house fly is another very specific fly.
Okay.
It's one that likes to come into buildings and into stables. They don't bite. They look very similar, but they don't bite. And they have similar kind of habitat. The larvae like to reproduce in moist organic matter, but not so much the rotting vegetation, more just the manure.
Okay.
So anywhere where there's animal manure, you will find housefly maggots, the larval stage of the flies.
Yeah.
And then they're important because they do spread diseases mechanically. Those bacteria and viruses are on the outside of their body, not surprisingly, since they spend so much time in the manure.
Right. And that's a really important point.
Yes, and so E. coli is a really important bacterium that can make people sick. It's oftentimes the causal agent of food poisoning.
Yeah.
It makes the horses sick too. It can spread diseases too.
Yeah.
So that's another fly related, but not the same as the stable fly. It doesn't bite.
I was in. So when we see flies in our house, does that mean that that's a house fly and it's not going to bite? It's just going to fly around and look for food, a dirty dish,
yes,
maybe.
Yes, oftentimes that is. There's another fly that comes into houses, but it's only comes in the fall.
Okay.
Yeah. So the one that we see in the summertime coming into our house is usually a housefly.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Because now it's September, and I don't know. I guess we have stable flies. I do a lot of things with my particular situation to try and help keep them at bay, but they're biting. And I've been in barns. People we don't care for them too much, and we say they're vicious. And of course, that's an interesting word to use. But they are. Is it because they're getting ready to hibernate and they know that they're only going to be able to eat a little bit longer, or because they seem to attack a little bit more and just be waiting to get in to try to get to something? Is there anything to that?
Well, it probably seems that way, but they're just responding to their cues too.
Exactly.
And yes, they do have to feed in order to lay eggs, and maybe this is the last opportunity because our summer is relatively short. And they've got to complete their life cycle at least to get to the larval stage so they can overwinter in their larval stage. Yes.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's very interesting. Do we talk about another fly next, or do we?
The another one that you and I talked about before the show were the horse flies and the deer flies, and how there's very little we can do to manage the environment of horseflies and deer flies, as opposed to stable flies and house flies, where sanitation and keeping the barn and the pasture very clean, the paddock areas very clean. Deer flies and horse flies, they're related to each other. They live in the environment. They reproduce in moist, muddy, organic situations like along stream sides, in the forests, anytime where there's water, standing water in the forests. And so we really can't control their habitat. So
but that's what we have in Maine.
That's right. We have this abundant moisture, water, and forest. And
beautiful,
it's a wonderful vacation place, but it does provide adequate habitat for those deer flies and horse flies. And after they reproduce and go through their life cycle, the adult emerges and they come out of that forested area away from those streams and into the sunny areas where we and our horses are. This on the screen is a picture of a stable fly, though, back that shows it biting the ankles of the animal.
Yeah, and look at, I mean, it's kind of sad to see. I mean, it's okay when you see one, but when you see so many, and the animal might be very miserable at that point.
Oh, yes, yes.
And if it's on one leg, they're probably on all the legs. So it's good to be aware and just kind of take a look and see what's going on.
As you pointed out, it can affect you. If the horse is jumpy or disturbed, it's a dangerous situation. Really.
Yeah, and I have been out there with knee socks on, and they bite right through my socks, and they really do hurt.
Yeah.
And you can see them, and this is, I think, a good point, too. You can see them. This is a white horse, so they're very easy to see. But people that have dark horses might want to look a little closer.
That's right.
Because if they're stomping or doing something, there's probably a reason for it.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So I think we do probably have some pictures of the deer flies and the horse flies. Oh, this is a good picture. It's actually still the stable fly, but it shows the life cycle of insects and why they're different from people. And probably one of the reasons they're so successful in the world, why there's up to maybe 2 million different species, is because they have these different life stages that enable them to survive in many different environments. So the adult fly lays its eggs, and then the egg hatches into that lovely wormy sort of stage that in flies we call it the maggot.
Yes,
and then,
not a real pretty term.
No. And they're the ones that need moisture. They live in those moist environments like a manure paddy or the rotting vegetation, or those lovely kinds, or stream sides in the mud.
Yeah.
And then
so if it looks yucky, get rid of it, right?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. And then the far right shows the puparium, the pupa stage, the resting stage between the maggot stage and the adult stage. And then the adult will emerge out of that cocoon stage, if you will, and that completes the life cycle. So that's what the fly life cycle is like, and we as people that want to try to manage them, we need to focus on where they are laying their eggs and see if there's something we can do to disrupt that, or where there might be laying there, where the maggots might be, so that we can control that, like you mentioned, you know, keeping things very clean and dry, and break that life cycle so that we don't have the adults coming out.
So it's constant work, in other words.
It's constant
every
work.
day.
That's right. That's right.
And the pupa stage that was there before, that's where they live in the winter, right? So all winter long they're protected there?
Either in the larval stage in a moist environment like in the mud, they have the ability to kind of hibernate even when it gets quite cold, or the pupa stage.
Because we get very cold winters here.
That's right, but so they've learned how to, or they've evolved ways of surviving.
Yes.
There's a picture of another fly that we hadn't mentioned yet, but it's called the face fly, for an obvious reason, that it also doesn't bite the animal. It's related to the house fly and the stable fly. You can see it looks very similar, but it has a yellow abdomen there. And they aggregate on the face of the animal.
Because? Why do they do that?
They are drinking moisture from the saliva and the tears of horses, and it causes the horses to tear more.
Yeah.
Which is very uncomfortable for the horses. It can actually attract other insects too.
But that would just open things up for an infection, isn't it?
That's right. And I know at least cattle can get pink eye. I think perhaps horses might be susceptible to bacteria that could be mechanically
some kind of infection,
transmitted by those face flies too. So that's why we want to. And they also reproduce in very moist manure. So getting manure out is the way to.
You're at least keeping the populations down, right? If you're
That's right.
being as meticulous as you can and clean as you can, you're keeping it down.
So there's a lot of different kinds of flies, and if we know a little bit about them, we can learn ways to outsmart them.
Now, let me just ask you, though, any benefits? Well, we already talked about the benefits to the stable fly, and all these flies are eaten by other little animals, the little frogs and
birds,
snakes.
Bats,
all of that.
Yes,
they need it.
They're an important part. They're actually pollinators, too, because when they're not...
What is that exactly? What does that mean?
Well, they're moving pollen from one plant to another, which is necessary for that plant to be able to produce fruits for us to eat.
I thought just bees did that.
Oh no, flies can too.
I didn't know that.
I know.
Very
Bees are more important, but many of these are visiting flies. So
okay.
there's our horse fly, and horse flies and deer flies are related to each other. This horse fly is laying eggs, and it's laying eggs on a stem of a plant, which is what they do. They lay their eggs on leaves that are overhanging streams or on aquatic plants that are sticking up out of the water. And then when those eggs hatch, the maggot stage drops right down into the water or into the moist soil around that, where they complete that larval stage.
Okay.
And they go through the pupal stage, and then the new adult will come out, and they do bite. And
Okay. Yeah, and they do hurt.
Oh, they've got these slicing kind of mouth parts that, you know, just
That's
take a
interesting.
chunk
Can
right
you
out
talk
of.
about that a little bit? Say, that was very descriptive, but say the stable fly mouth parts versus the horse fly.
They're both similar.
Okay,
they're
but they do
flies
take
and
a
they
chunk.
Yeah,
The reason they hurt is because they bite.
and they open a wound, and then the blood comes out, and then they lap up their blood.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
It kind of sounds nasty, but
It is.
It's, I know.
So, I mean, the good thing that I found about the horse flies is they're slow.
Yeah.
And you can get them faster than you can the stable flies. Are really hard
Slow.
to swat.
But they're persistent.
They're very persistent.
They do not
They
give
come
up
back.
easily. Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And I know.
And the horses know, and they're looking around, and they're looking for them,
and
they're
making
trying to
them
get
jumpy.
away.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, exactly. So there's the business end of
Wow.
this mouth part. You can see that stiletto right
Wow,
in front that's
yeah.
just ready to chop right into the horse's
wonder
skin
he eats
or
well.
our skin too. And are not found on our lower legs like the stable fly. So if you've got them on their lower legs, you know it's a stable fly. If they're biting around the head and ears or the back, that's more likely to be a horse fly
Okay.
or a stable fly.
Do the horse flies bite underneath their bellies, in between their legs? Do they go there too, or do
They can.
they can? You
yeah,
can. All
yeah.
right. Because sometimes I wonder if I just knew what this particular bite was from, I might be able to control it a little bit better.
Right.
But
there's
I don't
another
know.
insect that tends to go under the belly, and we were going to
Okay.
talk about that one
Okay.
later, which is of those biting midges. But I think we
Okay.
might have a picture of the deer
Deer
fly,
fly.
closely
Ugh, they
related to
hurt
the
too.
horse fly.
Yeah.
But they've got those kind of colorful patterned wings, and
Very
also
pretty.
you can even see the eyes there on the
Yep.
right. They've got those multicolored, kind of camouflage-looking, really strange-looking eyes.
Yep.
And the eggs there again, they've laid their eggs on vegetation, just like the horse flies. The horse flies and the deer flies are closely related. They are semi-aquatic or aquatic. They're found in the woods and streams, and then they come into the sunny areas
Yes.
as an adult to do their blood meal. Only
Yeah.
the females bite in the horse flies and the deer flies, as opposed to the stable flies, where both the males and the females bite. But
I see.
in the deer fly and the horse flies, only the females bite, and
Okay.
they eat blood and
Yeah,
and
and
make our
they
horses very
stay
uncomfortable.
there. I've noticed on my horses when I take them for real quick hand walks, they'll latch onto their necks.
Yes.
And if you try to brush them off, they're very persistent about trying to stay
Yes,
there.
and that's where those head masks or fly
Yes.
and ear protectors
Yeah.
can really be helpful, because they particularly go for the
I
head.
found that, yeah.
Yes, yes.
I've also found that if I'm walking, I walk in the middle of the road sometimes because I live in a neighborhood 25 miles an hour, so we walk in the middle because they don't, do they hunt by sight? Because if I'm walking at the very edge, they find us quicker than if we're walking in the middle. Is
Yeah,
there anything
yeah.
to that?
Well, biting flies all orient really, they can smell us. They smell us
Okay,
first.
so scent.
And what they smell is our
Carbon dioxide?
carbon
or-
dioxide, what all warm-blooded animals
Yes.
exhale when we're breathing is CO2. That's a very reliable indicator for them that, oh, there's a potential blood meal for me. I'll go and follow that. So they sense that with their antennae.
Yep,
And
okay.
when they get closer into the neighborhood, those that have large eyes, like the daytime hunters, the stable flies, the deer flies, the horse flies, all are active in the daytime.
Yep.
Then once they get closer, they'll use visual cues, their
Okay,
eyesight,
okay.
movement, silhouettes.
Okay, so if you stand still, they might not find you?
Well, they like
For a
the
while,
movement. The
yeah.
movement cues them in. That's right. That's right. So standing still would, you could try to hide yourself from them.
Yeah, and it's hard to do. But is it true that the horse flies, I've found that it looks like they like the sun more than the
That's
shade,
They
right?
do. The adults, they are the daytime active, and
Sun
they
lovers.
do. They leave and so that's another good point. You can provide shelter and shade for your horses in the daytime, and it will help to protect them from the horse flies and the deer flies, because
Okay.
they avoid the shade.
Okay, good, good.
So here we have
What is this?
black flies,
Okay.
and probably most Mainers are quite familiar with black
And moose,
flies.
right? You always hear about the moose leaving the
Yes,
woods because the
That's
black
right.
flies.
That's right. The more danger on the highway
Right.
because the animals
And
are
the
being
poor
driven
moose,
out.
right?
I
Yeah.
know, I know.
But do they bite?
Oh, they do.
They do bite,
Black
and
flies
that's part of,
they're
oh,
blood feeders
geez.
too. They're the ones that when we're out gardening or
things,
out in the
yeah.
pasture, they're biting behind
They're
our ears.
horrible.
And yes, they do. And they'll bite horses.
They're beneficial,
Absolutely
but they're
too.
horrible, yes.
They're not as active right in the middle of the hot, sunny part of the day as much as late morning and late afternoon. That's kind of the
Okay.
activity period for
Yeah,
them.
yeah.
They like sun, though. They're in the daytime. But overcast days are fine for them, too. They don't need bright
They don't mind,
sun.
yeah.
And in just to mention, that past picture showed that the larval stages are definitely aquatic. They're
Yep.
in our fast-moving rivers and streams. So our fresh water that we're so famous for in Maine, and
Yeah.
you know, it's good, clean water. That's actually where those black flies are breeding, and we can't do much to control
Okay.
them at their larval stages. But we have to protect our horses and
Okay.
ourselves from them in the adult stage.
So even if you're like half a mile away from water, in Maine, you're going to have
Even
the effects of
more
all
than
these.
that.
Okay.
This one, the biting midge, is another one that breeds in the water or in the mud alongside, but more stagnant water, not rapidly moving water.
Right.
And the biting midges are tiny, tiny, tiny. They're about the size of the head of a pin. They can come right through even standard window screening.
Yeah.
So if you have a problem with these, and I know you mentioned that you did, your horses had been bitten on their, they do tend to attack the midline of the horse, the belly, up under
They know
the
where to
chin.
go instinctually.
That's
The
right.
body, the
That's right.
heat from the body. I don't know what is it that attracts them to those places, because they're so safe there, and the horses can't
That's
do
right.
anything about it.
Yeah, they've just evolved a way to protect themselves.
Yes.
And since they are
I
so
mean-
tiny and they're insidious, they can do a lot of
Yeah.
damage for a small thing.
They hunt in numbers too. There's a lot
Yeah,
of them.
Clouds of them, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly, yes. I've heard of that, of horses just having clouds of
Yes.
these biting midges around them. They're most active at dawn and dusk. There are many different species of those.
Yeah, like mosquitoes
Yes,
are also.
yes. And here's
Okay,
here
so that's
picture of
one
our-
time we need to do something at dawn and dusk for sure.
Yes.
With the horses.
Yes,
Okay.
and as you mentioned, keeping them indoors is probably
Helps a lot.
good, yeah, either that or using repellents or protecting them.
Yeah.
With the armor kind of thing
Yeah.
that you mentioned. Mosquitoes, we have many different species. There's at least
I was
45 different species of mosquitoes just in Maine. And some of those are very important vectors of diseases. So not only do they drink our blood and our horses' bloods and bite, but they can vector diseases, and that what makes them even much more important.
Okay, can you explain that, vectoring diseases?
They actually inject the disease into us, that bacteria or
That
virus.
is amazing, yes, and very important information.
Yes, yes. So right now we're very concerned about Eastern equine encephalitis. It's been building, it seems to be becoming more and more prevalent in certain swampy areas in Maine. New Hampshire has had it, Massachusetts has had it for quite some time.
Yeah.
And people are susceptible to it too. It's quite lethal. Almost a third of the people who get it will die. Another third will have permanent neurological impairment, and almost 100% of horses that get it will die. It's a very lethal disease, so we really do have to be conscious and aware of it, follow the news reports, talk with your veterinarian about ways to protect the horse when they're active.
Yeah, and I think you told me that there are many different species that have this particular disease that they can give to humans and to horses.
That's right.
Not just one. So if you see a big mosquito, it may not necessarily be that mosquito. It could be the little mosquito. It could be any of them.
There are 45
right? We don't
different
really
species,
know.
and a number of them bite birds and mammals, and those are the ones that spread the disease from birds to mammals. And
Yeah. Now, can a disease be spread from horses to humans? Say
no,
okay.
that's a very important point. No,
All right.
no, only
So
from
that
the bite
doesn't
of the mosquito.
happen.
Right.
Okay.
That's right.
So that's interesting. Now the mosquitoes and the ticks that we're going to talk about in a second are important, but the mosquitoes carry, like you said, encephalitis is one that we're really concerned about. But there's also West Nile virus, right, that people are familiar with, and there's all kinds of new viruses all the time, right? So it's important, not only for the sake of the bite, because if a horse gets bitten, usually they get bitten multiple times, and it's itchy and it doesn't feel good, but it could also be causing a really big problem with disease.
And we need to protect ourselves. If we're out,
Yes.
wear long sleeves or use repellent or avoid periods of intense mosquito activity, because people can get those diseases too. Not from the horse,
Right.
or even from a mosquito that bites the horse and then bites a human. That it just doesn't seem to happen that way. They have to acquire the virus from a bird.
Yes.
And then they pass it on to us.
Yes.
So then we have the
ticks.
ticks, and ticks actually are not insects, but they're close cousins.
I didn't know that they weren't insects. I always
have
called
8
them
legs
insects.
as opposed to
Wow.
6,
Okay.
at least in the adult stage. There's 2 ticks that we find commonly on horses. The deer tick lives mostly in the woods and very close to the edge of the woods. So if you've got a pasture that's shady right on the edge, maybe within 3 feet of an area where you might get deer ticks.
Okay.
Deer ticks spread Lyme disease, and horses can get Lyme disease, and there are other newer diseases that we're finding out quite a bit too. In fact, the next show, I understand, is going to be focusing on Lyme disease in humans, but horses can get it too.
Yes, and actually all 3 of my horses had Lyme disease or have Lyme
Oh,
disease.
my
They were
goodness.
tested.
Oh, my goodness.
And I actually spoke to a veterinarian once that said that they would be surprised if most horses, of maybe 90% of the population of horses that go outside at some point, haven't been
exposed to it. Wow, yeah.
So it's a really important thing, and it's very hard, let me tell you, and you might know that already, trying to find a tick on your horse.
They're so tiny, and that's why we have to find other ways to protect them. But grooming them every day will help us, particularly with the other tick, which is there on the right, the American dog tick.
Okay.
We have about 14 species of ticks, but these are the 2 most common. And the American dog tick, so far, we don't think it spreads any diseases to horses in our area, or probably not even to people in our area. Though just slightly south of here, we know it carries Rocky Mountain spotted fever. So maybe it's just a matter of time before we have to worry about diseases spread to us by the American dog tick too. That one's larger. They tend to be in sunnier areas, pastures. So it's a good habitat for them. They like
good to know.
Any place where there's openings, roads or trails through the forest, along stream sides, in the pastures. You may find this one. The interesting thing about ticks, perhaps, that distinguish them from insects is they don't have wings. So they can't fly. They can only walk, and they're pretty small, so they don't walk very far. The way that they get around mostly is by hitchhiking a ride.
Oh, I've heard that.
They hitch onto birds and fly north, and then they drop off, and they'll find another host. They have another behavior that makes them pretty interesting too, in that they hang on to vegetation on the tall grasses with their hind legs, and then they stick their forelegs out and kind of wave them around and wait for a potential host to walk by.
And I've heard they actually jump, right?
No,
do
don't.
they jump? They don't
They can't
jump. Okay.
They just grab on.
They grab.
So
so we're not worried about ticks actually jumping, because I heard somebody actually say, "Oh, I think I saw them jump, but they don't."
No. But
okay, that's
it's
good
easy
to know.
if we just walk along some grass. It's pretty easy for them just to grab on.
But that would make sense.
The horse too.
Yeah. So I have a path around where I have my horses, and I actually rake it. And do you think that is a good idea, because then we don't have the leaves, and we don't right in the middle, and that way it's lessening the chances that maybe
I think that's a very good idea. Yes,
well,
leaf litter is where those deer ticks have their habitat is. They need that moisture that's provided by the shade from leaf litter. So,
there were some more pictures. I think there's one maybe we can show of the bites that some of the horses had. There's one right there. Do you see that? And what do you think that was from in July?
I think it's probably biting midges.
Biting midges.
And that's a very good point.
A lot of them, right?
Yes, the biting midges not only just bite, but horses in particular are sensitive to the saliva that the bites.
Yeah.
And it causes a dermatitis, a swelling reaction. Many
and
humans,
it was swollen, yeah.
Yeah, humans can react that way too. My husband is actually one that is quite bothered. It gets welts on his arms when he's bitten by those no-see-ums is another thing we call them, because they're so tiny, as I mentioned. And they come in hordes. And
cause a lot of problems, a lot of damage.
Yes, like you found. It took about 3 weeks for the skin to settle down. Sometimes veterinarians will prescribe steroids to reduce the swelling and the reaction. So it's an allergic reaction to the bite.
Yeah, and if your horse already has sensitivities, then you might consider that maybe they'll have more problems.
Yeah.
So there are maybe some mosquito bites on this horse. I'm not really sure to tell whether it's a spider bite or a mosquito bite. Is there a difference? Can you tell the difference between an insect, a mosquito bite or a fly bite, and a spider bite?
You can, but sometimes it's pretty
Hard,
hard to tell.
but there's something.
Spiders have two jaws,
Okay.
and there's a little bit of space. So if you see two bites that are very close together in
Yep.
pairs, I
Yeah.
guess that might be a spider bite.
Oh, I see.
But
Okay.
spiders love to eat insects. That's their primary food.
Oh, that's
They
right.
only will bite mammals if they are in a situation where they got crushed, perhaps.
Okay.
You know, if
Yeah.
a horse was, you know, swinging its leg and had a spider there, maybe it would get.
Okay.
Same with humans. If
Okay.
if we
Well,
just,
that's really good to know.
happen to
Yeah.
trap one or something, but they're not out there aggressively trying to bite mammals.
Okay.
They prefer to eat
Okay.
yeah. Whereas insects, you'll see just a single bite.
Right.
As
Okay.
opposed to a pair of bites.
And if we go back to the picture before, there's a picture there, and this particular horse had some kind of very strange reaction on only on the front of the back legs. From some kind of fly that was out there in July, and actually I've noticed that now it starts around June. If I don't attend to the skin and rinse his legs off and really take care of them and spray an antibacterial, antifungal, do something, he'll have a lot of problems during the course of the summer, so I don't know what that is. But maybe just something continuing and festering and going month to month, and you've got to do something.
Well,
and the black legs are harder to see that the insects
that's
are
right
there.
too. Sure. Well, those insects, they do, if they're biting, they can open a wound, and it leaves them vulnerable to a secondary infection. And sometimes they're actually, you know, transmitting the disease itself. So I'm not sure which way it might be in the case. We didn't mention the equine anemia that can be spread by deer flies and horse flies. So some of those biting flies can vector something.
And that's a
obviously
very
this is not
serious
anemia
disease
in this
too.
case. It's probably more like a bacterial infection that either was mechanically transmitted to the horse after it was bitten by the fly. So,
right.
yeah.
So it's important in the summer months to really take a good look.
It is.
And check them and make sure that they're okay. Now, we have another picture, and this was just a little bit of comic relief after talking about this. I have one horse that he looks out before he goes out. And if he sees anything flying around, he stays in.
He's learned his lesson,
Yeah, he
right?
has.
Yeah.
Or he'll run out and get a little bit of grass, and then he'll run right back in.
Oh.
So anyway, Kathy, it's been wonderful having you on the show. We're going to have another show where we're going to talk a little bit more about prevention and management. And we're going to have, there's so many products, so many things that we can use to try and help keep the populations down in the areas where our animals are, and to keep them safe. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And that's it for our show for today. Thank you so much for coming all the way from Augusta. We have your credits on the screen and the website if anybody's interested, and you were generous enough to even give us a telephone number, so we appreciate that. So this is Gabriela Rodriguez saying, remember, care for your horse, keep your horse, and enjoy your horse. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks.
How was that?
That was great.